Of all the lessons that we should learn from the mass shootings that have rocked our country, perhaps most important, we're failing young men. For the Colson Center, I'm John Stonestreet. This is Breakpoint. The state of our national discourse is, to put it mildly, discouraging and unhelpful. And the reactions to the recent trio of shootings only amplified just how bad it is. Once again, everyone just took their place along partisan battle lines to pound the same old drums. But it's past time that we admit there's something deeper going on in America than too many guns or too few guns or violent video games or the president's rhetoric or even the evil of white supremacy. That's not to say, of course, that there are no good policy proposals out there to address these issues, which need to be addressed. As a Second Amendment guy, I could buy into something like David French proposed last year in National Review, a system for family and employers to report warning signs and separate unstable individuals from their guns. But, as French admits, the best that policy would do is to keep troubled young men from acting on their violent impulses. It doesn't address the young men themselves or the source of those impulses, and that's exactly the issue that we can no longer ignore. Yesterday, I highlighted the crisis of virtue across our culture and how that will lead to the loss of freedom. It's a historical inevitability. But today, I want to zero in on the problem of men in our culture specifically, especially young men. They're not okay. Writing at the LA Times, professor of criminology Gillian Peterson and sociologist James Dinsley offered a revealing look at America's mass shooters. They've studied every shooter since 1966, and the vast majority have four things in common: early childhood trauma and exposure to violence at a young age, seeking validation in extreme communities, often online, openly admiring the work of prior shooters, and nearly all are longtime loners with an identifiable crisis point, like getting fired or expelled from school. Oh, and by the way, they are men. In fact, the young men who appear on CNN's list of the 27 deadliest mass shootings in U.S. history have something else in common. Almost all of them grew up without fathers. In other words, with few exceptions, the signs that a young man is headed down a dark road overlap noticeably with signs we see across our culture that young men in general are not doing well. Lacking strong role models and healthy social groups, increasingly being left behind academically and vocationally, floundering for a purpose in life beyond video games. Countless males are seeking solace in the only communities they can find, usually online, where the foulest kinds of hate, conspiracy theories, and nihilism await them. Now, of course, these factors don't always lead one to become a mass shooter. For every young man catechized into some toxic radicalism, like Dylan Roof or the El Paso shooter, or into nihilistic unbelief, like Dylan Klebold and the Aurora Theater shooter, and then choose to act on it with a gun, well, millions of others don't. Still, that doesn't mean that millions of others are doing well. It's quite the opposite. Our society largely fails to cultivate young men, to teach them about their own fallen natures, and to morally form them to choose love over hate and courage over violence. And thus, the epidemics we see of addiction, aimlessness, depression, irresponsibility, perversion, selfishness, victimhood, and low expectations continue. Until we face the fact that the root of our problem lies here, the fruit will continue to be bitter. Unless we rebuild the institutions of civil society that can cultivate young men, there's no way forward. We're certainly not going to fix this through government policy or mindless distractions. Only the church, with its kingdom vision and distributed workforce, has the necessary resources to target young men with truth, forgiveness, accountability, and hope. And on today's Breakpoint podcast, Shane Morris and I dive even more deeply into the issues confronting so many of our young men and how the church can and must respond. Join us at breakpoint.org or wherever you download your podcast. For Breakpoint, I'm John Stonestreet.